lovely to see you both. Lovely to be with you both. I was listening this morning to your most recent conversation, Daniel, with Matthew Allison. Always, yeah, there's something about the two of you when you speak together. I don't know, just it's always magic to me. I love it. I love those conversations so much. And I got to a certain point. Now, granted, I didn't get all the way through it, so I don't know where the two of you ended up. I never do. But there was, so you were talking about, I thought this might be interesting for today. You were talking about apprehension. And that really stuck out to me, this idea of apprehension versus calculation. And this, I often talk about, and I'm sure Seth will agree, the experiential element of the work that we do. And I think they're driving at the same sort of thing. So there was a quote. I wrote down something that you said, Daniel, that I thought just tied this all up and made me really alive to talk to you today. So you said there is a kind of mental activity for the human being. There is a kind of mental activity the human being is capable of that gains energy. And it's a kind of knowing that is like the artistic experience that is not energy draining. It is more on the side of negentropy than entropy. So this like, to me, it really struck me because that's my experience too. Like when you're in those moments of meaning and it sort of happens to you, I guess that's apprehension, right? You apprehend the beauty, you apprehend the meaning. They're energy giving. And there's something about this that is really key to, obviously for me, my mind's always thinking about the therapeutic process. Something like that we're driving for when we're talking about experiential, versus something more like a calculation that's going on. And then you also led into talking about intuition. And so like how obviously this speaks to a role for intuition, but how intuition can go wrong, right? That there are sort of these good and bad forms, maybe more trustworthy forms of intuition versus something else that we could maybe label as intuition. So something about all of that I just thought was really relevant to what we've been talking about as a group, this idea of authentic resonance, this idea of, and it's hard because we're using words to describe it, right? But something about that seemed really important for today's discussion. And I just wondered, Daniel, to put you on the spot a little, if you could maybe just briefly flesh that idea out a little more. Could you just give it a little bit more color, and maybe as a starting point and see where we go?
Absolutely. And Matthew Allison is outstanding. And I love speaking with that man. And so he is marvelous. And thank you for listening to that. I think, so there's a few things. We have come to believe that the height of human thinking is basically calculation or arriving at something logically. Syllogism, if A is B and B is C, then A equals C, right? There's a certain calculation that comes. But even as I even make that example, you can feel the energy drain going into it, like the logic that has to connect in different things. But think about when you walk into a room, and we've talked before about fields. We've talked before about kind of the authentic resonance and different things. When you walk into a room and you feel the vibe, woo, you don't have to calculate it. Has anyone ever calculated a vibe? Have you ever calculated a vibe? No, you just kind of experience the vibe. And also, I know Seth in the wonderful talk y'all had at Voice Crowd was mentioning with the method he works with on the idea of fight. And I can never say his name that starts with an F, but I know who it is. On the idea, yeah, it's a wonderful method. On this idea that I'm the last teacher you'll ever have because after this, you'll learn how to learn. This is very mysterious, but actually is central because there's this idea that once you learn to let the whole body think, once you learn how to kind of follow and listen, there's a way in which you actually apprehend a direction that if you go in, you will gain knowledge, that you actually, it's more of a following versus a leading. Because in calculation, often you're leading the direction of the thought, right? But if you actually let your whole body think, to use that wonderful phrase that Seth emphasizes that I love, you're actually more learning to attune yourself to something that is already in motion and already unfolding in you and around you, and you need to apprehend it and apprehend your alignment with it. But what's very interesting is this is not arrived at in terms of calculation. It's arrived at as more of a kind of full body. We spoke about the antenna, this sort of antenna and a tuning that you're operating according to. When you look at a painting, you don't send, well, let me use the other example of apprehension that I love because I think it helps the point. And we probably have mentioned it before, but you know the FedEx sign, right? Which has that negative like arrow in it. Imagine looking at that FedEx sign for a long time, and then one day you go, wait a minute, there's a negative space arrow in that sign. Whoa, you see something that was always there that suddenly appears to you, and now you can't unsee it, right? Or these optical illusions that are multiple pictures of one, and you then apprehend it, right? Notice what's very interesting about those is you don't calculate yourself into the new way of seeing the thing. Often it's a surprise. Often it's because you conditioned yourself, you moved around to see the picture in the new way, and suddenly you apprehend it. Suddenly it's there, right? Likewise, anyone who has emotional intelligence, they don't arrive at an apprehension of how a person is feeling by calculating. They're more paying attention. They're feeling the field and different things like that. What's very interesting is that apprehension, we can also tie the great Thomas Jockin, who's a tremendous classical scholar, has been speaking recently on Nous in Aristotle. And Nous is pretty much the key principle of life. Like whatever Nous is basically life. And Nous is the identification of life, and it is what something that is alive can do that only something that is alive can do. But what is Nous in Aristotle? And I would also think you see traces of it in Platonism, Plato and other thinkers, is basically this apprehensive act. Like, because when you see something and identify it as alive, do you calculate that thing is alive? No, you just apprehend it all at once, and you basically know it's alive, right? It's until some philosopher comes along and asks you, well, how do you really know it's alive? And then you question it. But in that original apprehension, there's a, yes, that is alive. And something that's alive also has this mysterious capacity to apprehend that this is alive, right? And you apprehend that this is beautiful, and you very instantly apprehend, especially with training, that this is just, or this is good, or this is, equality or not, or injustice, or so on and so forth. Now, critically, people like Aristotle emphasizes that this capacity for nous, though, has to be trained. You cannot assume that apprehension and intuition is automatically right every single time, right? So there are training. Well, how did they train the nous back then? This is pretty wild. In Plato, he's like, music and choir is really important. Like learning to sing choir because you learn harmony. If you never learn how to listen and hear harmony, you don't train nous. Gymnastics, the gym is important for nous. The ability to, play is important for nous. What's so wild is how this capacity is far more on the side of not studying and remembering, but actually using the fullness of your faculties to operate as well, right? And someone like Cicero also kind of associates, Cicero basically said if you wanted to be a great public speaker, you need to have a great breadth of knowledge, but also with that comes with this ability to actually apprehend across disciplines. It's not by chance that we've lost apprehension as we've become specialists, because apprehension has a lot to do with recognizing, sensing and recognizing patterns across disciplines, seeing something reoccurring that you intuit is there, and also knowing how to follow it. Because another way is when you could say that when you're listening to your body or following your body, there's a way in which there's a certain trust in a pattern of movement that it is heading toward or is trying to operate with, that if you use your logical brain, you will often actually miss, right? But these kinds of patterns, though, are not simplistic. Like, is dance patterned? In a way, but then if it's too patterned, it's bad, right? It has to be a dynamic, alive sort of orbit that you're following, right? That you're going in. It can't be chaos, but then if it's too predictable, then it also becomes dead, right? So you have to find what Aristotle, and then I'll stop, calls the mean. And the mean is not the middle. The mean is the fittingness, right? So for example, in dance, you have to find what's fitting between order and chaos, right? You have to find something that looks artful. Artfulness cannot be predictable, but it also cannot be too chaotic, right? Well, apprehension is really strongly tied to this recognition of the mean in all things, where you have this ability to sort of see, that thing actually is alive. It's not merely moving. It's not merely has the motions of life, like a zombie or something. No, that actually is alive. That meets the mean, right? And what's actually critical is that we are often judging means, discerning means all the time without even realizing it, right? We don't even know that it's occurring. And actually, again, for Aristotle, like without the nous, thought is not possible. Life is not possible. So if we're in a society that doesn't recognize apprehension and those capacities of the human being and actually tries to replace them with just calculation or logical thinking, then we're in huge trouble, actually. And actually what it means is we're just artificial intelligence, because basically AI is intelligence without apprehension. And then we decide that is intelligence, like Viveki says, we make ourselves like that. And of course, we have that freedom to do those sorts of things. So apprehension is a much deeper faculty of human grasping. And what's critical about it, to the point on the entropy and negentropy, entropy in thought is more a result of the process it takes to arrive at something. But the better you get at apprehension, the more you actually grasp it and feel the energy in that sort of grasping. Just like when you get excited in a conversation or there's flow in the athletic field, you may have been running, there will be marathon runners who will talk about at the 20-mile, they get into the flow and suddenly they're full of a second wind. People talk about second winds or different things, right? So it's very clear that energy does not necessarily have a kind of going downhill sort of way, right? When you actually train the apprehension or you actually train the ability to let things come to you, as opposed to you go to it. Because another way to look at it is calculation is when you're going to it, whereas apprehension is where you let the thing come to you. Well, that actually has a very different energetic experience, right? And I think actually, in terms of just kind of the sociological, political, and economic ramifications, if most people's experience of, say, thinking or reading, etc., is in terms of calculation, then we should not be surprised if we have a society that is not, say, an informed citizenship, such as democracy seems to require, and a society where people don't want to read because their experience of learning is always energy draining, right? It's always like, a drag, right? Well, this notion of apprehension, when you start bringing that into the learning process, then it becomes a self-turning wheel. And it becomes something that people are energized and excited to do. And actually, if you don't get this, to then speak to a final point, and then I'll pass it, although I always say that at least 4 times before actually passing it, it's a pattern, is that if you do not give people nous in that actual learning, they're still looking for that right? Well, the nous will give it to them in sensationalism, in us versus them dynamics, in extremism, and so on and so forth. That's the other, like this, I think there's actually real stakes in not cultivating this in people, because they're still looking for that drive. And if the apprehensive capacities are not trained, they're going to find it in, say, the dopamine or the sensationalism, and they're going to be manipulated, because we can give people something like that by making them angry or making them, afraid, or making them, feel like they need to go out and stop the bad guy, right? So the ability to find the fire, if you will, in, to have that capacity more at hand versus dependent on someone else to give you also makes you less manipulatable by institutions, politicians, and different forces. So there are real stakes in this capacity, I think. And again, Matthew is also, but I'll stop there.
Can I say something briefly, and then Seth, I'll hand it over to you. This makes me think too, Daniel, about like mental health and this over-reliance on calculation. People who are cut off from their body, who are living in their head in this over-reliance of calculation. This is the fact that the effortfulness nature of that mode leads to the sense of draining oneself, right? Because there isn't this balance. That is actually deeply reinforcing to unconscious motivations for a person to suffer. So if we think about someone who is being, motivated by unconscious guilt, or, this sort of self-punishing relationship to oneself, some, deeper motivation that would like this person to be drained, depressed, right? That this energy sucking capability of being caught in calculation and being cut off from one's body, this is all deeply reinforcing to that drive, right? And I think this is key to, like, I see and experience this in the therapy room so much. That's why this really is so alive for me. This difference between the drained, depressed position, and then the pushing even more so to thinking and calculating one's way out of it. That on the surface level, one can understand, how that might be an error, but even on that deeper level is actually reinforcing to something inside the person that would prefer them to be in that position, for whatever reason, right? And that once you can dig down and unearth that and sort of sort through that gives rise to this, all of a sudden being in a position where one is connected to one's body again. There is more energy flow. You're not caught in a perpetual loop of energy draining, very effortful cognitive. I mean, I think we've all been stuck in those sorts of loops before. I'm sure we can all relate. When you got grinding over and over in your mind, some decision to be made, and you're just stuck in these, and it's so draining. It's so draining. Anyway, Seth, I'm curious what you're hearing.
Yeah, I've been thinking about how clarity usually comes when the mind isn't the primary thing that I'm listening to. And it's interesting because there's all kinds of processes you could do, or maybe you're writing something and you're not sure how to start the next paragraph, right? You're in that moment. Well, what you could do is reread what you just wrote, think about what you're trying to convey, and you could do things. They're not exactly calculation, but you could sort of try to logically work out what the next sentence should be, or you could just get very quiet and then the next sentence might appear at a certain point, which is really interesting because in this example, we're talking about sentence, we're talking about words, we're talking about language, which tends to be the domain of mind. I'm really curious what goes on when I manage to create a bit of quiet in the mind and I tune into, a sensation somewhere in the body. And then, well, what I can say is before the words come, what comes is something wordless. And then there's just like if there were words, it'd be like, that's not it, that's not it, that's not it. Oh, And so there's something, but the thing is, if you, as we all do, live in a world where we're just swimming in words and concepts, it can be easy to fall into the sense that I should somehow work out or calculate what I should do next. And not to mention, as we've talked about before, that moment that we've described as authentic resonance might actually require me to piss someone off or, do just the opposite of what I've been told. So the thing about words and about thinking is they're so easily codifiable, right? And if I, stand on top of a mountain and look out at a sunset, I could say, that's what life is all about. But it's hard to call that back up the next afternoon when I'm in the city, like stuck in traffic, because that thing was a feeling. It really wasn't. I mean, I might even come up with a line of poetry, but the moment of coming up with the line of poetry versus reciting it again. So I mean, I've been amazed for all the work I've done to sort of emphasize the importance, the primacy of the body over the mind. I'm always slipping back into my mind. And it's always when I do something I wish I hadn't done, whenever I look back, it's because I thought I knew what to do. I thought I knew the answer. And of course, there's something called confusion that's real, like it's actually paralyzing and you don't know what to. But if you actually listen to confusion, if it was words, it would just be a swirl of words. I think when you do have some kind of clarity that we might call mental clarity, and I think that was part of the quotation from Daniel you read at the beginning, it was something about a mental. I mean, these words are useful because mental is a kind of orientation. And for example, if I say, oh, I was in a very mental kind of place when I made that decision, I think that's a meaningful thing. But of course, you know, the brain's inside the body. We can debate forever where the mind is actually located. But if my heart wasn't beating and I wasn't breathing, if I couldn't feel my body, thinking wouldn't likely be occurring. So there's a thing that we do in calculation, and of course there are so many fields and disciplines that are very connected to, you know, the wonders of modernity for the human race that do come from calculation. I mean, calculation has produced all kinds of things. But you know, when I was in grade school and got the answer to the math problem, if something pinged in my body, it probably had more to do with the fact that if I thought I got a good grade, I would be viewed in a certain way. I mean, it wasn't actually, I mean, because I myself never like a real true mathematician, and some of the people who love math, they're kind of mystical people, actually. Like they're not experiencing math the way we're experiencing it when we're doing arithmetic or trying to work out our taxes or something. But yeah, so I just think there's this confusion. I would love to understand how the aspect of myself that I call mind, that I call mental, could function in such a way that it wasn't sort of the thing that's always tying me up into knots. But I think, especially in the world we live in now, where you just get nothing but words and words and more words and this person's opinion and that person's opinion, it's very easy to fall into the trap of trying to calculate how to be a good person and to calculate how to be happy. And these are the things that I think come more from what Daniel's calling apprehension. So, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Please,
No, magnificent. Not to jump in. So there's a few things that magnificent, and I'm really glad you brought up the idea of clarity. So there's something for me, and a way I've thought about it, not that it's correct or the language is the best language possible, but a way I've thought about it is there's some very odd connection between clarity and circulation in your being, dare I say. If I were to say that, to use three categories that I'm using very generally and don't have to stick to this language, but a way if you have emotion, action, thinking, then actually you need to maintain a circulation between all of those for each of them, because there's an issue where if you kind of game theory and different things, where everything that is not in a relation ends up in a rational impasse, which is where it gets trapped at a certain impasse. So you were talking about, like, a problem with calculation is calculation that only has calculation to feed on eventually creates an impasse, and it becomes self-effacing. It gets enclosed in itself. Let's say that it's enclosure. Likewise, emotion, if it is left just to emotion, and it's emotion relating to emotion, it gets an enclosure and it gets in trouble. But likewise, if you have even the body without any like emotion or mind that is just relating to itself, it also can become an enclosure where people are trapped in their body and they're not able to, say, escape those situations. So you have to have a certain circulation where emotion, when you're stuck in emotion, bringing in the body or bringing in calculation can be very good. When you're in calculation, you need to bring in emotion or bring in body. When you're in the body and maybe just kind of putting your head down, going to work, not asking any questions, sort of moralizing, just going to work, right? You might need to think about it because maybe your boss is taking advantage of you and you're suppressing your emotions, and that's why your marriage is in trouble, right? So there's this idea where there's something where you have to always maintain a certain circulation between all of these things. If not, you're going to get entrapped in one of those areas. And what's very interesting is if you maintain that circulation, just like you were saying, Seth, suddenly, oh, I have the idea. Oh, I get it. You actually feel yourself getting better mysteriously, or you suddenly come up with the idea, as opposed to when you say, I'm going to do 20,000 words every day and you sit. I don't advise that. I think it is actually extremely important to actually say, no, you don't set like, I'm going to write 20,000 words. You write until you write until you feel like it's time to circulate, to ventilate, and then you get up and do something like action or blue collar or actually move the body or use emotion, right? I think very often the way we talk about dealing with problems is is using the logic that the problem is in to use that logic to solve the problem, when actually that leads to enclosures versus circulations. And then what's very interesting is if you have a healthy, dare I say, a fitting amount of circulation between these three areas, emotion, action, thinking, which again, I'm just using very generally, then the probability of apprehension is higher. Your ability to have things come forth to you in a powerful way is much more there. Because, and what your job is actually to condition your body to be a circulation, almost like blood. I associate energy with blood flow, because what I'm talking about is energy needs to circulate just like blood needs to circulate, right? Like if blood gets stuck, if like your health and your blood flow are pretty strongly tied together in the ability of blood to get to different parts of the body, right? Well, so I think it kind of is with energy. And energy often will get stuck in, say, emotion, or get stuck in action, or get stuck in thinking. And what's happening is, because you're not acting in a way to maintain there's a circulation between those things, the energy becomes entropic instead of negentropic. But when you have circulation, you actually have a negentropic experience. And also the probability, you know how I was talking about that FedEx sign, right? And you see the -0 or any sort of optical illusion that you see and you apprehend. Basically, if we follow notions like beauty, every single phenomenon in reality actually has the potential to be like that FedEx sign, to unveil itself in a new way, to be experienced according to a higher quality. And the probability of that occurring is proportional to the degree you can maintain circulation in your being between those areas, right? So actually the point of thinking is to coordinate that circulation, and then you put yourself in the world before different things and with different people, and then the apprehension can occur, because in your circulation, you actually make opening for the flow of the world, if you will, and the flow of others to actually reach you. And that then creates a negentropic system. That creates actually energy gaining. But the issue is that one of the reasons we don't like to do that is because the moment you start talking about three, you can talk about three body problems and it's unpredictable. And we want to be able to predict and note the outcome. But ironically, the only outcome you can guarantee is entropy. So if you live your life needing guarantee and needing plans and needing to know how everything's going to work out, that necessitates an entropic outcome. Because the only way to get something negentropic is surprise and apprehension and something occurring that you don't see coming, right? Because that's precisely why it gives you energy. And also that energy comes with a feeling of hope, because if something unexpected can occur that makes you feel this way, well, then reality is such where this possibility is always latent. And so there's always hope. There's always the possibility of this thing coming forth in this kind of experience. So to close, for me, there is something about maintaining a certain circulation, like the health of one's emotions, the health of one's body, the health of one's rationality and mind is strongly tied to the degree one maintains a circulation of energy between all of those areas, which requires a profound attention of yourself. Like, you know, I was saying this last night at the neck, like when Socrates says, know thyself, I think if we take that to mean pay attention to yourself, it's a much more useful concept, right? Because pay attention to, what are you feeling right now? Are you feeling like you're fighting the paper in the essay right now? Do you feel like you're fighting it? Well, then get up and then leave it. You need to move. The circulation is getting blocked on this essay you're writing. So get up. You need to sense that and actually stop yourself from moralizing. No, I should finish this essay before I move to the next day. Well, you're just moralizing the impasse. You're just moralizing the loss of circulation. But if know thyself is pay attention to thyself, and obviously attention with Gilchrist and Vey and Illich is a big idea. Like attention is, for me, to speak of attention is strongly tied to attention of circulation. Like that is what it kind of means to know yourself, to pay attention to the circulation. That are you getting blocked? Are you getting stuck in a kind of loop that's killing your mental health and calculation? Because what ends up happening, that exactly what you said, that leads to a lot of mental health problems, because you're stuck in a kind of loop of calculation and you're not actually circulating. The problem is, just because you're doing something does not mean you're circulating. Just because there's a voice in your head that won't turn off, that's not circulation. It's the appearance of movement, but you're actually not going anywhere. And one of the keys to attention is being able to tell the difference between, say, moving in place and circulation. I mean, that's one of the key qualities of attention, if we use that idea again from awareness, that's another way people put it, is actually being able to tell these fine nuanced difference between a lot of activity and circulation, right? Circulation, as we're describing it, is necessarily multi-dimensions, right? It can't be located in a single capacity like the mind, right? But you've got to be able to tell those difference. But then, of course, this would suggest that the prime role of thinking is actually to tell those nuanced differences according to awareness and attention, not just calculation. Calculation is actually best a conditioning of the circulation, of which allows the possibility of calculation, but that occurs when we get locked into a single domain, say thinking, or maybe emotion, or maybe the body, and we don't have circulation going on, right? And then the funny thing is, I do think the experience of when you actually do have circulation, the feeling of it is actually being more present in your body. You feel more whole. You don't feel like you're trapped in your body, nor that you're trapped in your emotions, nor that you're trapped in your thinking. You have this feeling of actually being entire, actually. Like people talk about present, right? That tends to be a good sign of circulation in the way that we are being described. But you have to be able to have that awareness, and it does seem to come down to the entire body as an antenna, as we talked about, to actually have these attentions. I'll pause there, but those were some thoughts.
Yeah, I love this circulation and ventilation, and I guess my mind goes to how do we facilitate another person's attunement to this? Like even like you could think about parenting, you could think about being in the role of some kind of practitioner, clinician, who's, you know, your job is you're there to actually kind of do that sort of thing, just being a friend, being a whatever. How does one, because, you know, we can easily see how this can become, as it often does, just another set of rules. Like, you know, I read in a book that there are 3 things that I'm meant to be circulating between, and now, you know, in a mechanical way, I'm going to go through those and hold myself very rigidly to it and give myself a hard time when it's not working because I'm not doing it right. And
Right.
you know, like it just becomes that again, like you say, this kind of faux appearance of, and there's this profound attention to oneself that you're talking about. How can we, I mean, I hate to use the word training, but I guess it is, how can we be helping to train that, either as a parent or adult to adult? Because, you know, you were talking there, Daniel, about perhaps thinking is this is kind of the place of thinking, that this might be kind of the tool that one uses for the discernment of that. But I don't know. I almost wonder if it's its own sort of category. There's something, to me, there's also almost something mysterious to sort of noticing and paying attention and sort of knowing that the movement is needed now. To me, even that seems to sort of be a nudge that comes up from within me, as opposed to kind of a thinking through, okay, I'm getting stuck in this now, maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm getting something confused in all of that. But that I think even this realm of thinking is just very confusing for people. And I think I think that language, what a thing. I think that we're getting stuck in this idea that it's almost like having a coach in your head. You need to have a coach in there. You need to have this part of you that is sort of narrating and keeping you on track, your life coach in your head. And they are they store all the knowledge about all the self-help books you've read and the things you should be doing. And some of that is the moralizing, I agree, but I think there's also like a whole separate thing it's not even necessarily moral. It's, I'm really, I don't know, like I should be talking to myself, and I don't know, and to be fair, I think it does operate in that way for lots of people. And maybe that's like the beginning of something that becomes more embedded or embodied or something. But yes, please, Daniel.
No, not to jump in. I should
No.
clarify. For me, there's a key difference between the word condition and conclude. So most of the time we use thinking to conclude. Actually, thinking is properly, once you see it having a role of this circulation, it's more about design and architecture for something non-thinking to break through, actually.
Right.
Like, so the word condition, like, what are the conditions that need to be maintained and kept so that something like a Heideggerian clearing can come through, right? Because what we've mostly done is use thinking to conclude what is the right course of action versus use thinking to create the conditions in which the right course can come forth in non-thinking terms, right? Like the big thing we talk about in reconstructing ASA is conditionalism as a certain middle almost between subjectivity and objectivity. As an example of a condition, take a shadow. How do you get a shadow? There has to be a very particular condition. It's not merely light on or light off. You have to arrange the thing in the right place, and the light is coming over here, and you have to pay attention to all of the environment, and you create the conditions where there's the possibility of a shadow. Or the possibility, what is a veil? A veil is very interesting because if it is too opaque, it's a wall, but if there's nothing there, it's nothing. So you have to figure out the condition to create something like a veil, and you find the mean, right? Because conditions and means are strongly tied, right? We've tried to use thinking as the mechanism of conclusion to do the whole, right? To arrive at the end. When thinking is, in my opinion, it is supposed to have the role of determining what are the conditions that can be set for something that cannot be done by thinking to have a higher probability of arriving, right? Because what that does is you're seeing thinking in an architectural and design role, and then that's making way for, say, emotions in the body, right? Like it's creating the space in which actually you can have the apprehension occur, but thinking itself is not the apprehension. It creates the space of its possibility. So it's much more architectural. It is much more thinking conditions, and then defending those conditions. Because another thing, and then I'll stop, more can be said on this, but like, I also think, like from David Hume, thinking is more about like self-defense than conclusion. If someone is coming up and telling you you're wrong, or they're trying to manipulate you into a political regime, then you have the logic and rationality to defend your clearing, to defend your space, to defend your relationships, as opposed to using thinking to arrive at the ultimate worldview that everyone must conform to, and then it becomes totalitarian, it becomes controlling of different people. So there's something about the creating of a space, something architectural, and then a defense of that clearing. But for me, there is a key distinction between condition and conclude. And unfortunately, most of thinking is conclusion, when really we're not. Another way to put this, conclusions are entropic. When you reach a conclusion, it feels entropic because then you actually stop caring about it. This is the irony. Like when you actually reach a conclusion, you go, yay. And of course, from psychoanalysis, we learn it never brings you the full happiness. And then you're bored, and there's all these kind of ironies that occur, right? Conclusions set you up to be actually entropic, right? But conditions that are letting things come forth that you cannot reduce to thinking are actually what create energy and are what are actually exciting and actually create mystery and the unknown. And like the rigor of mystery can occur, right? But thinking needs to be in service of creating a space for that unfolding of mystery, not to create a conclusion, because when it does that, it actually creates entropy. Happy to say more on that, but it's a very fair point you're making.
This is, I'm sorry, I'll pass to you, Seth. This is bringing in belief, right? Like as well, like, you know,
yes.
So you were talking about as well with Matthew Allison, I wrote this one down too. If there's no possibility of mistake, then is it belief or is it conclusion, right? And that just like so nicely, concisely put into terms what I've always felt. You know, the whole point of belief is that you are sort of taking a risk. You are that it may, and because I guess still my mind goes to, I understand what you're saying, Daniel. I understand what you're saying about setting the conditions. But again, for someone who is sort of listening or who's maybe not so deeply considered these things before, I can almost hear the question coming next of, okay, so what are the ways I'm meant to be thinking to create those conditions? Right, you know, like it becomes this kind of, tell me, give them to me so I can put them in my head as a list and a morning routine I can do, or like a thing I can do that is then going to fix it for me, so that myself can burst forth, you know, as opposed to something that I think maybe is more like, I guess, this constant kind of reciprocal connection of the idea of like, how do I ensure that there's something of me that is truly informing the thinking. I don't know how to put it into words, as opposed to some higher authorities telling me, and I'm like putting that software in place. And how am I? Yeah, anyway, please, Seth, I would love to hear what you've got to say. I'm still formulating words.
Something I'm noticing is there is such a thing in human history and contemporary society that we could call wisdom as a kind of a, I don't know, it's a commodity isn't the word I want, but it's a thing in the sense that someone does something which we call thinking, but maybe we could say they go and they live their life and they have experience. But some people do write books that transform other people's lives, right? And I mean, I love what you said, Aspasia. It's as if we're supposed to have that coach who lives in our head, and I just, like I just program the perfect coach and just stick it in there, and it never works. But there is something that can be conveyed from one person's experience to another. I was thinking earlier in the conversation of what spiritual teachers will call a pointer, right? It's like I say words, but the words are pointing to something. Don't look for the answer in the words I just said. And it strikes me that that is more difficult to do when we're not together, feeling the energy, feeling the circulation of energy, as Daniel was talking about it. I mean, if I'm trying to decide where to have dinner with my friend, I could calculate that my friend likes Italian food. But, if I just say to my friend, do you want Italian? Like they just kind of do or they don't, but they don't remember that they like Italian food and then say, well, that's logical. Let's do the, I mean, it's a silly example, but there is, so what's going on when someone writes their autobiography and says, when I was 20, I had this experience and suddenly everything shifted for me and I realized, and then they give you the pithy statement of what they realized. And then someone else reads the book and it clarifies something, but you can only guess that it could be, because so many of these self-help books are essentially the story of how the author cleared up their own issues, right? And then the problem becomes like, well, this is what everyone needs to do. And yet there might be a certain audience whose personality type is like that author and it works for them, right? And so this is a bit of the nuance. I actually, what occurred to me to put to you as a question, Aspasia, I could maybe wonder about Feldenkrais, but I was thinking about Davenlu and the work that you do, which was his genius, was his idea, his wisdom. I don't think you ever met the man in person, right? But something was passed down from him to you. And what you do with your clients, you're not putting a procedure on them, but you did go through a training. You did have, I've heard you talk about recording your sessions and reviewing them with someone who has more experience than you. And so there's I think maybe what we do when we train ourselves is we just change our overall relationship to the unknown piece, because you don't really know what any one of your clients has going on in their head. But after you've seen 100 of them, then the new person who comes in, it's starting to ping all these other experiences you've had. And just one other piece that I wanted to say, because as I understand it, what you're often doing with a person by all of these means is you're arriving at the place where the person realizes, oh, all of my life, I have believed this thought. And there is a particular thing which could be codified, but it's like maybe referring to what Daniel says, it's just stuck in there. And so the thing that they've made true for all times, and the classic thing would be, well, this was true for me to be safe as a child, but the error isn't that it was true for me to be safe. It was, but it's no longer true now. So, I mean, this is the danger of writing a book, you know, like the words can die on the page and just become.
Yeah.
But yeah, I wonder how do you understand like Dav and Lou through the lineage to Aspasia, and you're doing something that comes from his thinking. I just think the word thinking isn't it's another pointer word. It's only part, it's really, it came from his life, but I wonder how you respond to that.
Yeah, there's so much in that. And also my mind goes as you were talking there about really it's the developmental error. It's the, you know, say there's a particular thought that this person is stuck on. They're just unable to relinquish it. The drive is so deep, I must hold on to it at all costs. And it holds up this whole structure that I guess to put it in these terms is getting in the way of circulation that might otherwise be able to occur. And it kind of is. This always does sort of come back to a discussion about energy. Like I just don't, like I think about like Eastern medicine and like this really always for me when we get into these parts, I almost feel like it is a little bit like a Reiki almost. Like it's like if we really think it's like a reaching in and kind of help figuratively helping a person sort of reach in and like pull out a piece finally that then clears up the circulation, and that is kind of the self-healing part. Right now things can start to, and this is like a developmental injury that is no longer. Anyway, there's a lot I could say about that piece. I'm going to put that to one side because you asked me a particular question about Dav and Lou. So Dav and Lou was a very, from, I don't want to say words, anyway, from my perspective, from what I understand, Dav and Lou was a very intense individual, right? Like this is not someone who is very, like when I said, like he would, like to my mind, he was like all in with his whole body, right? Like he was, he developed these insights. He reminds me a little bit, I guess, in that regard, sort of like Feldenkrais. He developed these insights based on, to my understanding, kind of almost like this felt sense is coming up from inside himself, like following what we might call intuition. But then, you know, really rigorously trying to look at. So he started videoing all his work. And he would painstakingly watch these videos, just thousands and thousands of hours of videos to break down what is happening here with this person. And that's how he developed his method. And he got to a point where he was really working kind of, I don't know how to use these words, I guess kind of intuitively. He was just, you know, people who met him spoke about how he could just sit with you and he almost infiltrated your dreams is one way. He did, you know, for some people, like he could just sort of see you and almost do that, like pluck just the right kind of energy. Like he was so, and it's something that probably can't, who knows, but probably can't be easily replicated. It may just be a feature of him as a person, right? But he was able to at least codify to some extent some of what he was learning that had enough pattern to it. It could be kind of used. But the key, and I think maybe this is what you're getting to, Seth, as well, the key with all of these things, ISTDP, Feldenkrais, whatever kind of therapy you want to talk about, is one can't hold too rigidly to the theory and the procedure because one will miss the person in front of you. And to try and remember that these are, I guess, like means, like averages. They are skill sets that are useful to a certain extent, and then one must always be willing to sort of let go of them to some degree and sort of follow the lead. But there is something about, I think what touches me so deeply about Dav and Lou's procedures theory, he came up with a whole meta psychology as well. So there are key, I mean, I could talk about this for hours, but there are key elements that he brought into the discussion that I have just never seen discussed in therapies before. Like I've trained in lots of different approaches, and that seemed to cut through they just seem to cut through the noise. What is it they're cutting through? They just seem to be able to cut through, I guess, the calculation errors that are going on. They can just, in a manner that other therapies can't get to. I think other therapies fall into a, maybe going back more into a calculation mode, or I don't know exactly what it is.
They cut through the noise. I think of the body, I think of authentic resonance, right?
Yes.
And
They,
so even if we're thinking through something, I like what Daniel said about it's not always, it's not always a conclusion. But even if we're thinking in language, it's like, I'm trying on this sentence. No, that's not quite it. I'm trying on that sentence. Oh, that makes me have a new thought. Try on that sentence. It's like the thinking process is, in that sense, open-ended. But you also said another thing that struck me. You said Davin Liu was all in. And it strikes me that if we say mind, or maybe if we say body, but if we say anything that is less than all in, then we're talking about a part of ourselves doing something. And there may well be those occasions where we could get away with using only a part of ourselves. But for ongoing, just navigating of complexity, you kind of need to be all in. And I think that the challenge is that we have so many ways of ceasing to be all in. And maybe a person like Davin Liu gets it on a deeper level where it just becomes natural for him to wake up in the morning and be all in. I think that's maybe a piece. I mean, again, for the listener, we don't have the codes in this conversation, but I think if anything, to be responsible to, if we worry about what someone thinks of what we're saying, it's often more useful to talk about what we want to avoid doing that's likely to tangle us up in knots, than to say, here's the formula.
Yes. Yes. And there's a manner in which, too, I think what I'm describing, you've helped me get clearer there, Seth, is at least the way I think about Davin Liu, he seemed to be able to, the type of focus he could have on the person. So when the person, the client, the other, whoever is sitting, is there in front of him, it's just completely that, like he is completely sort of immersed in, right, and really feels the other on all these different levels, I guess, all at once. It's not just running through a checklist in one's mind of, okay, can I see the breathing and what's happening with it? Obviously, all that's gone, it's become, but it's a real entering into the other person. That was, that's the way that people talked about him too, like just the sense that he could, I guess, apprehend. And obviously he's a human. When I don't want to overstate what he's doing, but the ability to feel, like, you imagine being the other person on the other side of that, to feel that someone is really laser focused in on you. I mean, it can be both terrifying and anger inducing, but that you are, they are there. And if you think about that idea, even from an attachment point of view, of the mother being the mirror, like how important mirroring is for the caregiver, for a self to develop, to understand, oneself, we have to see it mirrored in the attuned caregiver. What is that attunement? And again, I think even parenting textbooks and things, sometimes it's all about language, putting everything into language for the baby and the child, and oh, you look sad, and like putting it into words. Obviously that matters, but again, developmental stages, I think sometimes, especially in adulthood, perhaps the language is fine. They've got the language. It's not actually that you're kind of trying to attune to and mirror for the person. It's all the nonverbals, and the relationship between things that's going on inside the individual all at once. And I think maybe drawing out like that geometry or something for the person just in your presence, there's something about that. I've just said a lot. I don't know where that came from, but somewhere within me. Yeah, it's a really apt point, Seth, because I mean, ISTDP, it's not unlike, I guess, all sorts of schools of therapy and approaches, in that it's got its own factions, if we talk about it like that. It's got its own, you know, stuff going on in terms of people that hold really rigidly to it in a certain way, and this bit's particularly important, and hold on, Devin Lou never really talked about that. How come that's developed and everyone's doing that? And there's all that that goes on too. And for me, I just try to I guess I just try to tune into, I sort of try things out, I guess, but so much of what led me to ISTDP is my own gut instincts, it resonated with things I was already, you know, wrestling with internally already, and it just sort of met me where I was at, and so I try to follow that as well, as opposed to which side am I going to fall on? Which group of people am I going to align myself with in the way that I practice ISTDP? And in that way, it really is just sort of becoming my own ISTDP, but with my infusion. Like and I don't really know how to put that into good words yet, but that is more important to me, because then I feel that my body is part of the process as well, as it should be. Like this is all part of the process, as opposed to I guess getting stuck in those loops of thinking, or calculating, I should say. I do think some of these terms are particularly helpful, though, that we've been talking about today, like calculating. And the other day I was trying to describe something to, this is maybe an aside, please pull me back in if it is, but I was trying to describe something to someone, and we were talking about something, and talking about, like, you know, it's cognitive versus emotional or psychological. And then I just sort of thought, I don't even know what psychological means anymore, particularly. Like as a category, it kind of just fell away. I was like, well, we were talking about cognitive and emotional, and then psychological. Well, what's psychological versus emotional? I don't know. And the body, and like just these categories, they just get confusing. And even when we were talking before about mental versus cognitive, and like, are they different things? Like what's mental, what's cognitive? I don't even know what terms mean anymore, but I will rein us back in. Pretend I didn't say that last bit, and please proceed.
No, but well, not to jump in, but I think the very slipperiness of language, or the incompleteness of a term, speaks to that. Language is actually not what we think it is. It is more about design and coordination and conditioning, not calculating or conclusion. I mean, a radical reading of Derrida is not that Derrida actually in his deconstruction is saying that language doesn't exist. Language is not what we think it is, that it is actually some sort of exchange of energy, basically, to move around a certain condition for new possibilities to come forth that is not merely the information of the definitions of terms. Like when we use words, we're trying to create a certain space more so than exchange information. But we think about words as definitions. And so what we do is we think when we speak that we're exchanging information, but really what we're doing is we're trying to create a certain condition, a certain space in which you're able to apprehend things you've never thought before. You apprehend more than conclude. A conversation where you're concluding what you're going to say is entropic and tiring and often small talk, and you want to get out of it. A conversation full of apprehension is one that can go on forever. And I would argue that Derrida, the good reading of Derrida, in my opinion, is actually suggesting language must be about conditions of apprehension, because you cannot explain language according to definitions. And he does this whole philosophy of difference and all of that. You're saying because no one before they use words thinks about a dictionary, picks the words one by one based on definitions. You just find yourself using terms, right? You don't even know, you just find yourself using terms. But as you're doing it, you're really not calculating what words you use as you use them. You're using them from a felt sense, from a deeper sense, and hearing them as you use and go, yep, that fits, yep, that fits, yep, that fits, that fits. But it isn't primarily a conclusive activity. And actually, though, the problem is the moment you ask, what is language? Then you start calculating about language, which makes you forget that you didn't use calculation to do language, and you get an entire misidentification of what occurs in the speaking act. And one could argue that happens in all of these domains that we're talking about. The moment I ask you what the thing is after you did it, you have to use a different mode retrospectively from the one by which you did the thing, which leads to confusion and misunderstanding. And that's where memory, in the deeper way that Plato means it, is not merely the recall of information, but the ability to re-reside in the experience, right? Like that's memory, like trying to reside again in something that is no longer present, which is, of course, impossible. But that's what you really need to do, or else all you're going to do is retrieve information. And that's going to lead to a misunderstanding of what occurred. So I think that's an issue. So a few things. I think a lot of it,
very
please.
briefly, just throw in. I think like spontaneous speech is sort of what you're pointing to there too. Like
Yes.
this is why spontaneous speech, free association, someone who's just free to speak without trying to manage what their presentation, manage how they're seen by the other. It is because it's coming from something more maybe body based, or that is why we are able to, maybe if we're trained to, apprehend patterns that are going on below the surface and issues that are going on with circulation under the surface from a spontaneous speech. But anyway, please.
No, absolutely. And then kind of, I think Derrida would say is that we have convinced ourselves that speech is rightly calculated to hide from speech that is spontaneous, in which truth comes out.
Yes.
So then, and he would also, I think, suggest we do a whole lot more spontaneous speech than we realize, but then we act like it was intentional to conceal ourselves from it. Now, of course, that is a gauge that varies and so on and so forth, but we actually have a desire to believe that speech is more constructed than it actually is, because that hides us from the truth of speech, which is that we predominantly operate from an interiority we cannot calculate. But then, of course, that can be scary, because then what else may come out of me? What is this thing alive in me that I can't fully bring into intelligibility, and yet it is the source by which the majority of my self and understanding is occurring? Like if you really pay attention to how many thoughts you have that you don't intend, how many things you say without intending it, you would have to conclude the high majority of what comes out of you is things that you don't really understand how they're coming out of you, or where they're coming from, or the mysterious alchemy that is making their possibility. And if you take that real seriously, well, then we may have to rethink what it is to be mature, rethink what it is to develop, rethink what it is to spend our time, right? Because the way I would also put a lot of this is we exist today under the tyranny of planning, and we don't have any preparing, because we think that everything is planned. It's mechanical. I know I can calculate it, right? So a mature person has plans. A responsible person has a 5-year plan. We plan everything out, right? All of this is a way to conceal ourselves from the fact that the majority of ourselves is unplanned. And that, if that is true, then we would spend a whole lot more effort on thinking about how to be prepared for the unplanned, because you can't plan the unplanned, but you can prepare for the unexpected, right? You can't plan a surprise, but you can prepare for a surprise. And we exist under a tyranny of planning, and so we're not able to think in terms of preparation. And that distinction that I like to base on Ivan Illich, I think also gets on this problem of how do we avoid having a formula that if you follow all of this, you will take care of those things. There is no formula, but there are things you can do to be prepared for opportunities of apprehension, prepared for the unexpected, and so on and so forth. So, for example, you can't take Seth's class and have a 5-year plan, but you actually are prepared to reside in your body and all of the things that affords to you, right? Like, I can't do various therapies and plan for where that's going to put my emotional life in 10 years, but it actually prepares me for things that I don't know are going to occur, and it conditions me to have a better inner architecture, to actually come to terms with myself so that I have a better circulation and have more experiences of apprehension, better energy, et cetera, so forth, right? And so what you see is the problem is a lot of the things that make us most human are not things that are matters of plan. They're matters of preparation, which by definition means you can always wonder if they do anything at all, because preparation always entails risk. So, for example, if you're prepared for the collapse of the government and you have a whole lot of food in your garage and you're a prepper or someone like that to an extreme, you run the risk of being a fool, right? And of course, you can never prove that you're going to need those things. But then maybe it turns out it's good, right? Likewise, you can spend a whole lot of time, say, preparing to be healthy in a relationship, and then maybe you never meet someone, right? Or maybe the conditions are such that you never are married or something like that, right? But if you didn't do that preparation for marriage, then if you got marriage, it could have been a terrible thing, or it could have destroyed you, right? Because you weren't prepared for it. A lot of people say plan for marriage, but they don't prepare for marriage. And the society also doesn't let you know the difference between those things. So it often sets us up for trouble, right? A lot of times we plan to avoid hardship. So that's how we deal with negative emotions. We just make plans so nothing bad happens to us, because the whole idea of a plan is to avoid surprise. But then when the bad thing does happen, it turns out we're not ready for it. Well, that's your fault. If your plan was better, things would have gone well. Well, if you would have planned your relationships better, if you would have planned your business better. So then what we do is, by not having the planning preparation distinction, then we moralize planning. And when that feels like it inevitably does, because it must if we're not artificial intelligence, well, then it's your fault for not having good enough of a plan. And we never then do the work of thinking, what do we need as a society to cultivate, to prepare ourselves, because we're always moralizing the planning that apparently platonically can be perfect to make sure nothing bad ever happens, but inevitably it does. Because if you were never surprised, you'd be dead. You would be a robot. You would be a rock, right? So there's a distinction between planning and preparation here that I think is very useful. I'll also note quickly, when you were talking about it all seems to come to energy, classically, the words spirit and energy were much more tied together. Like when they talked about the spirit or the spiritual things or religion, like, sure, I'm not saying it was just energy, but the word like spirit, like is tied to Raihai, wind. It is the animating principle. Like we really, there is a very real sense in which when religions and theologies are interested in questions of spirit, they're actually talking about something very practical, which is energy, right? And then spiritual practices like fasting, for example, there seems to be pretty good evidence that fasting can be good for energy. It can, it can be good for you if you do it in the right way, right? On these kind of ideas that some of these spiritual practices actually can have beneficial health benefits. Well, then spirit and energy gets tied together. Now that would all have to be expanded on, but I think we don't appreciate how much spiritual matters and energetic matters are tied together. And of course, they're very spirited. Well, we know that, but we forget that connection. So I think that's important. The last thing I'll say, and then pass it, but then there are, I think, things like, so for example, like on things people can do, generally a real good way to be prepared is to face fears. Facing fears can be a very good thing to prepare. Another good example, do something that everyone around you thinks you're crazy to do, okay? That you really want to do. Do something that you're not going to be able to explain why you did it, right? Because that sort of thing is very necessary for actually developing the interior space that is able to apprehend more. So I do think there are things you can do, but they're not predictable. They're not plans, but they are things that prepare you and cultivate you and condition you to actually be able to apprehend more and to have greater circulation in the ways that we're describing, right? Like as an example, if there's nothing in your life that you are doing that you cannot justify in terms of, say, pragmatism, like explain why you're doing, that's a problem. Most people would say that's a virtue. No, it's a virtue to be able to give a pragmatic reason for everything I'm doing. Actually, it's a problem, because often these deeper developments require you to do things that you cannot give a pragmatic justification for. That creates a higher dimensionality, which will bring me to the last thing I'll say and then pass it. One of the reasons this is so, another way that I think about all this, that is part of the complexity, is because ultimately what we're talking about, to use language I always like to use, is the movement from algebra to geometry, of which then changes what all the things are in the structure. Okay, and let me explain what I mean by that. So let's take this as a flat plane, okay? And you have, and I'm going to use those terms, you have emotion here, you have thinking here, and you have action. Okay, if you have a flat plane, which this is that's by essence algebra, okay, because it's just basically a single space, right? The only way to move between these is to literally move between them, okay? So you have to, so they're not connected, but you have to move. You are here and you're moving between them, right? When you do that, there's always a calculation problem. When do I move to emotion? At what point do I then go to action? At what point do I go to thinking, okay? And you're always going, the relation between action, thinking, and emotion is an and thinking and emotion and action, okay? The problem is if you do that, you're always going to be entropy. You're always going to be entropy, and it's always going to be a movement. What you have to do is add a geometry, like a dome that connects all of them. Because once you do that, at any point on that structure, you're on all three of the points at the same time. And then thinking, emotion, and action, and instead of being an and, it's like a slash between them. It's thinking slash emotion slash action. When you can add, then lifts up the 3 points into the structure, you're then operating in that structure, and you are using, like Seth was saying, you are using thinking, but thinking now has a different quality that is inseparable from emotion and body. It's all, what you're doing is you're making them all together. But here's the problem. You have to start, like maturity should be a movement from this. As you get older, you go more like this, okay? You have to start this way, but at maturity is going, you flatten it and then you add geometry, and they all become the structure. They become the points on the structure that are all together at all points of the structure once you do this. And I know this is hard to, like, no, here they're separate. They must be separate when you're young. As you get, maturity is learning how to do this. And then at any point on this structure, you're on all 3 of the points at the same time, because this structure is founded by all 3 of those points. So the problem of calculating those when you move goes away. And I would say the teacher you were describing, Aspasia, is on the structure. That's why he's mostly apprehending. Apprehending is what you do here. Once you're on the structure, you actually are able to apprehend all 3 of those together, because here you have to calculate, here you can apprehend, and at any point on the structure, you can apprehend, just like this, right? And maturity is a movement from calculation to apprehension. And so as you move on to a higher metageometry of being, to use very loaded terms, you actually are occupying all algebraic points at the same time, emotion, thought, and action. And so when you think, you also emote and act. When you act, you also think and emote. And when you emote, you also act and think. Because once you get here, you always do all 3 together, actually. And I think you see, and that also is a defining feature of expertise. Like the best artists, when they're always doing the expertise, right? Like even when they're not doing it, they're doing it, right? Like great masters of crafts are mysteriously, as they're cooking food, also working on their poetry. And as they're working on their poetry, they're also working on their not need of poetry. Like you get this higher geometrical structure in operation. In maturity, I think, I'll stop here. But maturity, like they're points, then it moves here and you have a structure. And when you're on the structure, you're then on all of those points at the same time. But again, the last thing, well, one more. The problem is the very act of discussing this, though, must be sequential. That's also the problem. Language is and space. You can't make a word by removing the space between all of the words. So you're always going to have the problem of the communication of this higher geometry being algebraic per se, because words are separated, right? They are a sequence, right? You don't apprehend, like the appearance of words are in an order, in a sequence, and thus it comes across as a calculating activity, right? If you're just looking at it. But then, of course, the more you actually train in language, the more you actually do increasingly experience it as something that just washes over you, right? Like that's a key. When you're younger, you tend to hinge on every word, like, nervous, think about. But as you get older, you actually become more able to let words wash over you, So they actually are more pointing to the structure. But nevertheless, language is still in its activity sequential. So that's another problem here, is the very act of talking about all of this creates the impression of the non-existence of that structure. And instead, it just seems sequential. But let me pause there.
Yeah, and I'll be quick again. Sorry, Seth. I keep it's on the tip of my tongue. There's something that I love that. Thank you. I love the developmental aspect of this. This is so useful. Because it's almost like, I don't know, tell me if this makes sense. Is it almost as though on the plane, once circulation is able to occur and flow at in a particular manner, with a particular speed, whatever, without a level of effortfulness, right? That allows for then, like, it's almost like a hologram that almost allows for then the higher geometry, right? Like to kind of.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so that's beautiful. And so this actually fits too with, I think, what you were asking me about too, Seth, with Davenlu and ISTDP. And a lot of what's at the core of what we're trying to do in that approach is we are teaching people to hold multiple things at once. It's like, it sounds so simple, but it really is. It's not a, like you said, this kind of linear choice of, I'm here now and have to feel this one, or I'm here and I have to think, and now I'm feeling, and now I need to, it's actually holding, and it's really hard to do. This is, complex mixed emotions, essentially. Being able to hold both and notice both within oneself at once without having to choose one over the other. They are both there happening at once. And really helping a person to pay attention to that actually really quiets the mind. And the agony of trying to manage that, some part of yourself that's aware that there's two conflictual things happening at once, the agony of trying to manage that through thought or cognition or whatever just falls away once one is able to just, oh, I can just have both, right? And that's kind of a new starting point that is much more peaceful, from which, there's still going to be the emotional tone and everything, but the anxiety, which is the thing that you experience when the mind is racing and you're trying to manage them, when that's gone, emotions have a completely different quality to them that people used to think was an like most people think that their anxious anger, which is really just the anxiety that sits on top of the anger, that most people think that is what the experience of anger is. And once you can clear up the anxiety, they can actually just feel the emotion of anger, as an example. Anyway, and it's very different, and it's much more, it's without distress. It's without distress. I was going to say peaceful. It's not, it's enlivening, but it's without distress. And you feel more able to make decisions, or to start from there. And the other thing I wanted to also mention what we were saying about energy. That's what clinical psychology did. It took away energy, like it became the scientific discipline. And I think that's where the idea of like energy being any part of this kind of got scrubbed, and everything must be very measurable, what I'm trying to say. So I think, clinical psychology as a discipline really got rid of anything that might be sort of more spiritual or mysterious, or this idea of energy that is so key to all of this process. And that's part of what I love about, any of the psychoanalytic or psychodynamic approaches, which are quite separate from from clinical psychology per se. None of that was in my training, like my university training, because it was clinical psychology. And it's just such a shame. But I did want to say, too, as we're talking, I think it's clear to me, maybe in reference to your question, Seth, about ISTDP and DAB and Lou, is it's like, for me, the technique of ISTDP sort of prepares, is a estimation of something you can do that might best prepare the conditions for this this circulation, or maybe it's authentic resonance. It prepares the conditions that authentic resonance is therefore more likely and able to occur, but you can't make it occur, and the person can't make it occur, but it's the clearing thing. It's a technique that pretty reliably can prepare the conditions for that. And for this kind of circulation that to me sounds like is more energy giving than energy depleting. We're trying to create a form of, like there's always going to be, I think it's important to recognize that this isn't about reaching some level of like spiritual great enlightenment where all we're ever doing is, like we'll still get stuck in things, but trying to change the balance of that. Now something is cleared enough within me where that sort of authentic resonance or the circulation can be happening well enough that there are enough moments that maybe the balance changes, that they are energy giving versus the energy depleting stuff, so that as a whole, I'm moving somewhere. I have some, I'm alive, I'm enlivened, as opposed to feeling deadened and just like dying every day.
Yeah, you were just talking about clearing something. And earlier, Daniel was talking about an interior space that affords a possibility. If I asked you, should I speak softly or speak loudly? You would probably say to me like, well, depends on the situation. But if I was a child in a household where I learned if I'm smart, I will speak softly, what can happen as an adult is I can think about speaking loudly, and that even that thought is forbidden.
Yeah.
Right? Like this is one of the ways we really screw ourselves up with thinking, is we actually don't allow certain thoughts. You know, like, or someone gets mad and we think, I want to kill that person. And then I think, oh my God, am I a murderer? No, 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 no. You know, but already the body is contracted. You know, this something if we want to use their word energy, we've restricted the flow. And I've been having a really interesting experience with this conversation. I think this happens in all kinds of conversations. So we've defined a territory that we're exploring together. But you know, when one of you is speaking, my attention is still following along, and I'm definitely feeling things in the body. Sometimes you say something funny, and so there's humor and there's joy in the body. But in any case, if it was a different conversation, that would be happening too. But I'm currently tuned to this conversation, right? And so, so Daniel was talking about Derrida and how Derrida, you know, says what he says about language. Well, I've never read Derrida, so all I can do is take it on faith from Daniel, who's read the book. But then what you were saying reminded me of something in my childhood and something I mentioned yesterday, and I guess Daniel might have heard, but I was speaking yesterday about being a kid and speaking in tongues, right? And what you said about Derrida is that he says, well, these words, we think of them as definitions, but actually there's just, you know, these are the words that are flowing out of my mouth right now. I didn't go in a dictionary to find them, right? Okay. And what happened for me as a child is I learned to speak, but I always tell the story that was second grade. I don't know if it's, but I have this image in my head of walking to school and talking to myself in tongues, because as a child, I had learned to speak English, but you know, with a child's vocabulary. So we're still learning, oh, I've never heard that word. What does that mean? And the first time you hear a word that you don't know what it means, especially if you don't have any sense of etymology, so you start to make guesses about words as an adult. But as a child, you just go, that's the weirdest combination of letters and the weirdest, like, how do I make my tongue say that? And so what I did is I kind of reversed it and I said, oh, I've been taught how to pronounce all these words, which are constructed from letters. And I mean, part of speaking in tongues at times for me wasn't, the funny thing is actually it was somewhat calculated. If I put this letter and then this letter and then this letter, or I liked rhyming, right? And so I think of all the words that rhyme with, you know, clap. And so I go tap and stap and zap. But at a certain point, it was like, you know, splap. And it was like, why isn't that a word? But it rhymes. And it, you know, and so what do you do with splap? Well, you can spell it. It would be SPL, SP splap. Yeah, SPLAP. Or so what do you do with that? But it comes out of my mouth, and then so this is the part where also then Daniel says, what about the thing that you do that no one understands why you do it? And are you willing to do it? And so again, this is kind of the story of my life, because when I was in college and I was in the avant-garde music community, I had a friend who played saxophone, and he was a mathematician, and he made this whole grid, and it involved the circle of fifths, and it involved, you know, he took the 12 notes of the scale, and he made it go from, instead of 1 to 12, he made it go from -6 to +6. And then he put the Fibonacci series through base 12 as if it was from -6. And then he put it on a chart, and then he put it on the music stand, and he went and played the saxophone, and it could be in any key because what he was doing was all intervals. And I think Daniel, who's a musician, knows kind of what this might mean. But I mean,
I used to play the saxophone.
Oh, okay, so you can both get it.
Not well, but I played the saxophone, yeah.
But so I was amazing. Just like, what the hell? And I mean, I couldn't actually verify, was he doing what he said he was doing, but that's what he said he was doing. And I know that he was my housemate. He would be in the basement, and what I would hear was very fast series of notes played very quickly. So, but I took the idea and I said, what is language when I don't, like, what does Swedish sound like? Well, it doesn't sound like meaning to me because I'm not a Swede, but it sounds like the most interesting combination of phonetics. And when I try to learn Swedish, I just, trip over my tongue constantly. But these Swedes, they have this incredible capacity to spit out all these weird sounds. And then I said, I guess that's fluency. I guess that's what we call being fluent. So what I did is I took a series of meaningless syllables and I put them in a grid like my friend did. And then I said fluency would be I can move through it in any way. And so I started playing with this. And then if nothing else, it's a good story. But there was a part of me, and I mean, even to this day, I can't fully explain why did I do that. But I know that I was compelled to do this. I was and to the degree that I have any unique insights in life, I sometimes think maybe it's because that weird experimentation that I did with language, and it just fascinated me and I kept going. But here's the last thing I'll say is, so we talked about, I could be a child who decides that it's like a universal truth that I should always speak quietly, and that later is going to hurt me in life, maybe just because I can't get my voice heard or whatever. But I think there is, when we talk about someone has a really free mind, it's like I can think I'm so mad I want to kill that person, and I'm not frightened of having the thought. And the fact that I don't scold myself while I'm thinking means I just think the next thought, the energy keeps moving, right? Yeah. So then if I wonder about Davenlu or Feldenkrais, or I think of my grandfather, who was a lifelong peace activist, right? But the thing that I could say about him is he really lived his whole life with one idea, right? So he went to jail for not fighting in World War II when this was the good war, because damn it, he's against war. And his whole life was about being against war. So you could agree or not, or you could argue with him, but it's like every experience he had was through this frame. And even if it wasn't a universal truth, I think it pointed back towards his feeling. It pointed towards that interior space, like Daniel's talking about. So, people have certain affirmations or mantras that actually serve them, that actually make them more capable in life. I mean, potentially there's some rigidity that maybe they never run into, but I think it's possible. Like, I'm trying to find in myself, what is the argument for how thinking is this healthy, beautiful, wonderful thing that doesn't just tie my body up in knots and make me feel like I have to inhibit my emotions. And I think that it could be that I could codify something like maybe the thought that Davenlu has is just something like, there's something going on with the breathing. And so he just keeps watching the breathing, And then he gets to a point where maybe he's seen something enough times that he can put something into sort of declarative language. But it comes from the fascination. And I think though, now I feel like Daniel, here's my real last thing. But a thought I had recently about presence is
it's the numinous, right? It's like the numinous. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, let me say the last thought, but I could say I'm really present because of all that meditation I did, and I'm really good at it, and I know how to be present. But I could also be present because, wow, I'm fascinated right now. What's happening in front of me has my complete attention. There's nothing else I want to do but this. And I might never have sat on a meditation cushion, but boom, we are doing the thing that feels the most important to me. So I'm imagining that those people, whether, using the examples, Davenlu, Feldenkrais, my grandfather, who are all very different people, but I imagine they all had clarity about what fascinated them or something like that. They had clarity about what would it take to put me into that space where I am generative. And then, it doesn't much matter at that point if I'm cooking or writing a poem or hiking in the mountain, because everything always points back to my axis of aliveness or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Of course, I could never find that thing, and then I could just keep reading self-help books looking for the formula.
One quick thing I'll say, and Daniel, please jump in. I do also, just kind of continuing on though, I do wonder if sometimes there's like a ceiling to that, or because look, I don't know about the other people you mentioned, but I am thinking about Dav and Lou, and then just other figures that I can think of, where obviously such an incredible immersion into what they're doing, and ends up generating something that is so useful beyond themselves, and but then there is kind of a, like for Dav and Lou, the kind of the tail. So he recently passed away, but the tail end of his career is quite controversial, even sort of within ISTDP circles, which we could talk about another time. But sort of almost, I don't know. So sometimes I think about, like, like the maybe the descent into madness or something. I don't want to say that's what happened to him. I want to make that very clear, because I don't really know all the details of it either. I just know stuff from what I've read and heard from people who have been there and worked with him. But there is, yeah, I do wonder sometimes too about maybe, is it a taking it too far, or a ceiling, or something becomes recursive and or collapses in on itself, or maybe it's just old age and actually truly just like a, neurofibrillary tangles and amyloid plaques that occur in the brain as you get older that just lead to, like, who knows?
Completely map something, like the artist that makes 5 records that their fans love, and then they decide they're just never going to make another record that sounds like those 5 records ever again.
And
Everyone's mad. For them, it's like, we totally did that. We got it completely.
Yeah.
Wasn't Jung like pretty controversial at the end of his life?
Yeah, his red book. Yeah.
I don't know about it. I'd love to hear from Daniel now,
Yes,
though.
me too.
Yeah.
Everything that's been said is extremely important. So as a quick note, what you're saying about the ceiling, usually the ceiling emerges with
Where curiosity can take you when you have to bring it back into society, when you have to pay the bills, when you have to make it intelligible to other people, and then you start saying, well, I'm a genius and you guys are evil. Or when you get to the, but what can also happen is you get to the place where you're unwilling to give up your curiosity, and actually it's no longer a curiosity, it's your identity, and it's become ego. And that's where, like, the great, like the genius who did something great, but then they just keep going after. It's like, you should retire now. Actually, knowing when to stop is actually really important. And they don't know when to stop. But this is where, for me, thinking as self-defense is important, because you're using thinking to maintain that space of curiosity. You're saying, okay, I got to pay bills. So how do I do it to protect my curiosity? Okay, I need to go into society or I'm just isolated. How do I figure out to make this understandable enough to other people to where I can socialize? Or how do I keep it hidden in a way that's not deceptive, but not do it in a manner that threatens the curiosity? So thinking becomes strategy to preserve and defend the curiosity as we are understanding it, right? And usually the ceiling is hit when people don't actually transition into strategical thinking relative to the social order, or they've lost sight of the fact of, wait, this is no longer curiosity driving me, it's ego. They're not sensitive to that, right? So what you've actually done is, in the name of your curiosity, you've stopped defending the curiosity from yourself. You actually become a threat to your own curiosity, and you have to actually use thinking and strategy to defend that spirit that is alive in you from yourself. Actually can occur, or from other people who do not understand it. And so for me, thinking again is self-defense, and the curiosity thing is also very important. And what you were saying about making the sounds, what you were doing is training apprehension. You were creating a way to train your ability to apprehend, because you wanted to see, can I actually do all of these sounds together and do them quickly and apprehend that I've done it successfully, and I've apprehended these noises, and I also want to then be able to apprehend them together in a manner. You were training apprehension, but you see, the ways you train apprehension are also pretty much almost always that which have to be self-created, because otherwise you're being bestowed it by something external from yourself. And so what you do is confirm if you're doing it like you were told. This is the dilemma of training apprehension. If someone told you, hey, Seth, use this chart of different sounds and see if you can come up with like different languages, you actually would not be training apprehension even if you were doing the same thing, because it was given to you by someone outside, and what you would be doing is seeing if you met their standard. But that's confirmation, not apprehension. And so the problem, the reason why apprehension is so mysterious, and usually the people who have cultivated this ability are different or have their own strange path or things like that, is because by definition, apprehension has to be something that you gave to yourself to learn how to apprehend. And another way to put it is, what's another term that we've kind of authentic resonance, right? The ability to have an authentic resonance, that's it. Likewise, if you're writing a paper for yourself without a professor or teacher, and you have to judge if the argument works or not, or if you're reading a book or like a humanities or philosophers in a way that is your own work, you have to train your own capacity to apprehend and discern that work. The problem is, if this is also the way you train apprehension versus confirmation, almost necessarily cannot be institutional. It cannot be within a system that bestows, right? Well, here's a problem. If mental health, for example, is often a result of a lack of apprehension, how do you create institutions that help give people apprehension if apprehension seems to be something that must be arrived to internally? That seems to be a contradiction. This contradiction, though, and as we know in Hegel, all thought ultimately begins in a contradiction, like real thought is in a contradiction. This is the contradiction of 2025 society, that we find ourselves now having to create institutions that create spaces for activities that in what they are necessarily are in tension with institutions, right? And that's the problem. But that's a design problem. Whenever you have, here's the trick. Whenever you have a contradiction, then what you need is geometry, because contradictions are algebraic. There are no contradictions in geometry. And so what you have to do is you have to design, you have to create an architecture. So another way, something very important. So you made the point, and this is correct, Aspasia, that the circulation is the inflation, if you will. Another way to look at circulation is air. It's getting the air flowing, so you create the dimension, right? And there was also this interesting question of, why is it, so it seems to be the case that circulation creates energy versus gives up energy. It feels negentropic, right? You get the whenever you do this, it feels more energetic than entropic, right? The reason is because it's not merely if it's flat and you get the circulation going, what ends up happening actually is this. You get a spear, actually. And there's curves that actually move you in the very structure. It moves you without trying, right? Because now we have a curve and it's never flat. So even if you're not doing anything, you find yourself moving and actually having energy, because here, the only way to move on a plane is to walk it, right? If you stop moving, you stop moving, right? But on a spear, if you stop moving, you can keep moving, actually, because the curve allows it to keep going, right? And so what ends up happening is, when you actually have development in this way, you find yourself having energy where the very way you think creates you learn to think in a manner to let the geometry of your own internal development move you for you. Whereas if you're just here, the only way you can move is by using energy. You have to walk around. But once you develop to the place where you can do this, you actually don't have to use energy to move. You have to just trust in your internal development. The body knows. The inner geometry of the spear knows. It will move you, right? So you begin moving, right? So the issue is, also too, like, contradiction is the inability to advance, right? Where you can't go forward anymore. Contradiction as such is only possible here. But if you have a spear, then there's no necessary contradiction, because you can always find a new point to move at, right? So what we have to do is we have to think about, basically, institutions now have to be incubators more than institutions. They have to incubate this more than be a ordering or defense or facilitation of this, because that is what creates the energy expenditure and the impasses and so on and so forth, right? And that is, again, an entirely different way of thinking about what you're doing. Let's say in school. Okay, if I'm in school and I'm thinking this, I'm like, my job is to make the kid walk from here to here. So I'm going to use energy. I'm going to use discipline. I'm going to use force. I'm going to use whatever I can to make them walk. My goal is to make them use energy, ultimately, is what it means, right? Well, if instead you come into school and say, no, my goal is to get here. So my goal is actually circulation, and then let them on their own be their own energy. Because I should also know when this occurs, that tends to be when fascination occurs, because you find yourself moving and not knowing how. This is the key to curiosity. When you are really fascinated, one of the things you're fascinated is by your very fascination. You're fascinated that you are, in fact, fascinated. You find yourself suddenly motivated and self-propelling, and it's wild. You're like, wow, I just spent 20 hours working on this thing, and the time flew by. You're fascinated by what your very fascination did to you, right? And that it's you. What happens on the spear is you become a certain wonder to yourself in the very way that you find yourself almost mysteriously moving, right? Because most of your life you were like this, and then suddenly, bam, and you just find yourself moving, even if you're not using, you don't feel like you're using energy, and yet you're moving, right? So fascination becomes a fascination of fascination, and this self-turning wheel, to use that Nietzschean phrase, and that drive that occurs, right? Well, if you are the teacher, then you're actually not a teacher if you're trying to make a spear. You're a facilitator of the incubation of that fascination, and you're trying to create a space where people feel permission to, say, create their own language, or to create their own words, or to work their own projects. And then the other kids in the classroom are more about providing social support and social familiarity with people doing things that they don't understand, but they're okay about being around people doing things they don't understand. And they become okay with doing something no one else understands in front of other people. Because if you don't have that, then you have a ceiling to your fascination, and you're going to have to keep it private forever, right? So if you're thinking about new schooling, you're also thinking about how to have people train their own apprehension according to, say, their own project, to speak generally, but then already be doing it, say, in social environments, so they don't have that ceiling up ahead. And then the people there are also used to other people doing their own work, and conversation becomes a discovery of all of those unique works people are doing, in a communication of their means of apprehension, and that becomes education, right? That is just one example. Much would be said about that. I do like the Nordic Secret books by Lena Anderson. I think they're quite fascinating on the school system. It does seem to be that between 1815 and 1950, there are examples of schooling systems that were more trying to do this instead of the flat, but they're very few and far between. But I'm just giving this as an example of, if you said, hey, what we want to do in our institution of school is actually not this, we want to get here, then you would think about it differently. I do think it's possible. And then I'll pass it. What we're facing is what seems to be a contradiction, okay? The contradiction of we have to train apprehension, which by definition seems to be alone, right? We have to square that circle. You will never square it unless you change the the geometrical goal from a plane to this. And in geometry, there are no contradictions in geometry. So you just have to figure out how to make an institution an incubator to give rise to that development. And the teacher becomes a facilitator trying to create circulation. But then the teacher, again, if the teacher knows, well, there can't be this without circulation, and that kid is stuck in their emotions, well, then I, as the teacher, actually have to get them out of that blockage, right? Or, oh, they're stuck in their thinking, I have to get them out of that blockage. The teacher suddenly has a role of getting kids out of their blockages, not just giving them new information, right? And there are different techniques for overcoming blockages. You know, Alex Ebert has made this point where, one of the ways you get out of sadness is, Osho was like, you're not sad enough. No, get really, 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 really sad. Actually overly saturated. And if you overly saturate it, you can blow it up, right? Like sometimes the problem with thinking, like Seth was saying, is people aren't actually thinking enough. You're not thinking through it enough. If you actually thought enough, thinking at a certain point blows itself up. It saturates itself up. Like rationality that tries to be ultimately rational all the way can kind of free itself from itself, right? So, and I think there are other ways to do it in therapy, repression, different things, facing fears, physical activities. There are different techniques for overcoming blockage that different students, quote unquote, can use for different circumstances. But in this institution as incubator, if I put that very generally, you're thinking differently about what you're doing. We've got to make sure there aren't blockages, right? We have to create incubators. We have to create spaces of socializing individual projects that train individual apprehension in a manner that is actually able to maintain sociability. These are very different ways of thinking about things. And if we don't think about these things, then we're just going to keep running into contradictions we can't overcome, because here you can't overcome them. Oh, and by the way, every time you try, you use energy. So then, of course, everyone is freaking burned out, of course. Burnout on this is inevitable. This is your destiny is burnout. It has to be, unless you have unlimited energy, which you don't. So burnout is inevitable, okay? But guess what? On here, burnout is not inevitable, because literally if you're not doing anything, you still move, right? You're still moving. So the only way to avoid burnout, nihilism, et cetera, so forth, is an inner geometrical sublation. And the facilitation of that in its incubation becomes completely central.
I want to start a secret society, and we're just gonna
Right.
make this.
That's right.
I love it.
That's empowerment too, right? Like that's what empowerment really is. Like, you know, you think about the schooling system or this workplace for adults or whatever. It's sort of it's like a trust thing too. It's like a handing over to. Yeah. Please, Seth. Sorry, I cut in.
Well, you asked the question, Aspasia, about facilitating authentic resonance in another person, and I think that's what Daniel's been talking about. And because I think what can happen is if a person creates a space without blockages internally, maybe just because they're having that experience in an embodied way, they can put their attention on another person with a blockage. And, you know, there's all kinds of skill sets. Like if, you know, it's an athletic coach, that's the best person to help unblock the athlete. But whatever they're doing, I think they're looking for, does this person resonate with the experience that I already know in my body? And of course, we don't have to be masters. You know, I think someone who feels mastery in a particular domain will have that feeling, and then they can teach that particular thing. But I'm thinking of a conversation I had earlier today where a friend was essentially helping me think through things. And part of what she was doing was just, she had so much clarity in herself, and then she would just kind of look at me and wait after asking a question and keep looking and keep waiting. And what was very clear to me was she's clear. Not that she's clear on what the answer is for me, but she's clear that she's waiting to see if I'll get clear. And in the light of her gaze, I just sort of looked for clarity on a level that I might not have looked for it without her. You know, there's something that she was doing, and we can call it energetic or the antenna. Yeah, she was sort of looking at me.
Trusting in her own momentum of her globe spin, right? Like,
Yeah.
Right, but that's the thing. I mean, if you've ever had a feeling of being in flow, and then you encounter someone who has none, you feel the deadness.
oh, yeah.
You know, and I'm sure I've been the dead one on many occasions, you know, but when everything is working for you, and it doesn't matter if it rains or shines, or if, you know, you're late for the appointment, none of it bothers you. You're in this particular space, and then you'll see someone who's frustrated, and you'll think, wow, they don't have access to all of their resources, because I can feel what that feels like, at least for this one golden moment that I'm having this great day. But if I have empathy, perhaps I just have a little more sense of, or a little more capacity to imagine the other's experience, or because I have clarity in myself, and it doesn't matter if it rains or shines, maybe it also doesn't matter to me if you continue to be frustrated or not. You know, so I'm not trying to fix you and stop you from being frustrated, because I'm annoyed that you're so frustrated, but I'm just with you. And it's like, I'm reflecting the frustration because I'm pretty empty. But maybe by doing that, the frustrated person, I keep putting myself in the role of the person who has flow and mastery. So I'm not sure if that's always true,
Yeah.
but you know, if one were to do such a thing, right? Yeah. So anyway, I'll pass it on. But I think there's something. Didn't one of you at the beginning of the conversation, I think, was using the word transference, or this was yesterday? You and Luke there was that discussion about. But I think transference is I don't know. It sounds like there's something in me that I take out and I pass it over, and now it's in you. I don't think that feels exactly like what really happens, but there might be something that if it's in the one person, that feeling like osmosis, one can offer the clarity that they have within themselves to the other person, and somehow by osmosis, the other one, by being in the same shared field as a person with clarity, it makes them get their own clarity easier somehow.
Yeah, this is beautiful. So this also ties into, a toxic relationship dynamic, someone who, and you can think about just the classic examples of the child who has to learn to be more emotionally mature than the parent in order to parent the parent, who will forever remain childlike in their emotional maturity, if we put those terms on it. These people often become therapists. So thinking about someone being more like they're able to be sort of a spinning globe, they're able to be in that mode, and then to be in relationship with another person who's more on the plane, right? If we talk about it that way, but the person on the plane is asking off the other person to do the thing they want to siphon the energy from the person who's doing the spinning globe thing, right? Because they're unwilling, unable, whatever you want to call it, to get off the plane. But they want the energy, and it becomes this toxic pull. And if we link this to transference, like one example of what we're talking about is that someone who enters therapy, for example, who's had this kind of history as a child with a parent, where their own kind of emotional maturity or their own, what are we calling this, circulation is sort of weaponized or used not in their own betterment. It's not empowerment of the child. It's actually used as a tool for the parent, right? So if you think about this person now, they become an adult, right? And they come into therapy because something's wrong and they need help. And this part inside them that has learned, when I enter into a dynamic with another person who is, maybe it's a woman, maybe it's someone who's like an authority figure, something that resembles, that pulls up the pattern inside them, if this is like I'm with a parent, right? They enter into that dynamic with this whole thing alive inside them, that if I start to, this person's going to want that from me too, essentially, right? This person's going to need me to take care of them. This person's going to need me to parent them. I'm trying to think about how to fit this into the analogy we've got here of the spinning globe, and it's kind of mucking things up. But this person's going to need to be I need to be the energy provider for this person, and therefore, therefore I'm going to be exhausted. I'm going to, and it's all going to be about foregrounding and lifting up this therapist so that they feel like a good therapist. And you see this play out in all sorts of ways, right? So the good patient who sits there and tries to do all the right things for my glory, so I can say, look, we fixed your problems. And that's what's alive sort of unconsciously in them, because that's what they're used to doing, serving the other person. And so if you talk about the transference in that example, the idea is that that person who enters the therapy, who's had that relational history, if I'm activating that template inside them, they are likely to experience an immense amount of rage just in turning up to sit opposite me, no matter what I do in that moment, because I am bringing up a template of someone who wants to abuse them, essentially. So in your working towards your betterment, this person's going to take advantage of me as I do that. So when we talk about working in the transference, really that's just code for, there's a kind of anger that a person might feel if I do make a misstep, or I do forget a detail of their life, or, it fits the situation and that's relevant. And then there's an intensity of an anger that's also sometimes unconscious, to make things further difficult, that is not just about me, it's about the lens through which they experience me. So there is the proportion of anger that you're noticing in your body here that's about me. Maybe you don't, I don't know, maybe you don't like something about me, or maybe the chair's not comfortable enough in this room and you blame me for that, or something like this. There's a portion of not liking, but then there's this whole other chunk of the anger that's pulling up for you that's not about me. It's about your mother, that you can never experience about your mother, or it's about all these people in your life who've abused you in this way, or your ex-wife, or whoever it is. And that I am the portal through which you are experiencing these emotions that have not been placed in the correct place in your emotional memory, if we call it such. So working in the transference just means being alive to not just the feelings that I will bring up as me, Aspasia, you know, but as a placeholder for all these other people. That's what working in the transference is. And then there's the projection piece, which is what I think you're probably getting at more, which is that I locate my feelings inside this other person. You know, clients looking at me saying, I think you're angry at me, or, you know, when really what's happening once we get to the base is that actually part of them doesn't like me. Part of them's feeling angry towards me, right? So yeah, gosh, how did I get there?
I mean, what I was trying to get at is how is it working when you authentically help the person, or, you know, but what you're just saying is interesting, because let's say I go there and I basically treat you as if you're my mother, and I get mad or I do something like this. But if you have clarity inside yourself, the fact that I'm in a rage doesn't bother you. And then I notice, well, when I yelled at my mother, then she left me alone. And I yell at Aspasia, nothing happens. So now the pattern doesn't make sense anymore. And I start seeing, I'm yelling at my therapist. And if that could happen, it would take, like, what it would take inside your nervous system to afford me the possibility of having a new thought in a familiar situation where I tend to go into this archaic pattern. I think that's a piece of it. And I mean, when Daniel was talking about you know, what happens when we have mastery, but then we need money or we don't know when to stop. Yeah, those might be distortions, but I would think that, you know, one version of this is not that you're some kind of iconoclast or the weirdest artist that ever was, that was the most daring. I mean, you could be someone who wears a suit and tie and has a very, you know, just a mainstream kind of occupation or whatever. But if you have that clarity in you, you don't feel like an automaton when you go to work. You actually just feel like, well, I'm a human being doing this cool thing that humans get to do. And you might be the happiest person in the office, even though, you know, someone else would think, God, what a boring life you live. Because, you know, you're not Bjork or something like that. But I think, yeah, I think it's the internal clarity that then allows me to just have choice. And I could choose to conform to an external situation, but it's from choice that I'm doing it. So it doesn't feel like I'm being molded from the outside. It's, I decide from the inside to fit myself into the situation because that's agreeable to me. And yeah.
Not an abusive maneuver. It's not a I must. It's not a, you know, sort of that high stakes, almost like your survival depends on it, that we get stuck in, which is like that siphoning off. And I think just, yeah, really briefly, like, I guess a good therapist in that sense is being able to do sort of what you were describing, Seth, with your friend earlier today, being able to just sit in the space, like without, like kind of like trusting in the capacity for a person to start to get their own momentum, right? To start to become kind of that globe. I keep going back to this globe. It's not, I'm not going to press buttons in you that are going to, yeah, that's going to do that. But actually, maybe a lot of the time what people need is actually almost like this negative, like just this, I will do, like, I can just sit with you. I can just sit with you. And that it actually allows the space for someone to actually start to experience what is happening inside them. Now it's not all about how my therapist is feeling about me, how they're looking at me right in this moment. Am I doing it well? Am I not? Are they going to, you know, so that is some of it.
The therapist, and I get the sense that there's actually nothing I could do that bothers the therapist. And that gives me a new thought, like maybe I could be like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ever felt that way. It's always felt like I had to be a particular way, but maybe there's a way that person doesn't appear to care about all these things that I think are so important to conform to. Maybe I was wrong about needing to conform to those things.
Yeah. And one of the, just to kind of throw this in, one of the things about this, the school of therapy, the way that you also go about doing that on a much deeper level, is that you almost encourage, like you talk about it and explain it, but you almost encourage that they actually experience the full extent of those feelings towards me that are also about the mother. Like you actually want to bring them right up, because you can have them here with me. Tell me all about them. Tell me about this urge to, you know, rip your mother's head off and stomp on her body, and like have that here with me, right? Can we do that? Like they do it through me. They imagine doing it to me or whatever. Like this is, again, just an example of something, could be all sorts of things, but that they could do that there with me, and that we could look at those very scary things together, and that they don't fall apart. They don't get consumed by anxiety. They don't die, and that I don't punish them, right? That, and often what people actually experience on the other side of that is they feel much more connected. All of a sudden, that kind of haze of seeing me through the prism of someone else falls away, because it's not needed anymore. And then there's more of a relational clarity. Like people really feel like they connect to me. Oh, like people have described how I actually look completely different to them on the other side of it.
I was going to say, I was hearing that the perception would change.
Yeah, no,
It
no,
would almost be like a psychedelic moment.
it is.
Probably.
Mhm. I
Yeah.
remember someone once saying to me, "Oh, you're not really that old." I have had the opposite too, though.
Well, is your brother?
I have had the opposite too, though. So, you know, but whatever it is, like that, there is a, when I talk about clarity, like I do mean it on all these levels. There is a change in all the senses. I've had people explain the room is different, like, you know, they remember things being a certain color and now they're not. And they're usually always linked to something in their childhood that shows you that they are experiencing me through the lens of a memory, right, of someone else. And this happens for all of us. We all do it. And I don't know how much you can clear that up 100%. There's some level of it because we're almost designed to use that to some extent. But this is to go back to the circulation piece. This is how you really pull it out from its root, as opposed to I could just talk to them about, you notice how you're experiencing me like your mother now, and we could talk about that for a while, and as though just talking about it is going to make it stop happening. You know, like maybe like 5 or 10%, you might be able to have some sort of conscious control of like cutting through it. But the experiential, emotional focused component of this is then we move into the emotional realm. So now we might understand it with speech and thinking now, but now I guess let's make the move, right? Let's bring in, let's let the emotion come up. This thing has always wanted to be experienced within you. It's that, like, so emotions have a natural rise and fall. And I think this goes back to what you were saying before, Daniel, about that idea of like sadness. How sad can you get? And finally it reaches saturation and you move on. And this is so true. A lot of what we do is we try and manage a feeling because there's a fear that it's going to overtake us. It's going to lead to suicide, or it's going to lead to us screaming at our partner in a way we can never take back, or whatever. So we're doing all these things that cut it short in our body. And when it gets cut short in our body, it sits there and it's not happy. It's not happy, and our body's not happy. And then there's all this anxiety that's desperately trying to keep it squashed down because it's such a scary thing. And so this is all that like tension and energy expenditure that goes into that. You know, people are exhausted by this. And you would know, Seth, are holding their bodies in all sorts of ways that they're not even aware of, that is part of this mechanism. And so the idea being, let's just finally let that thing out here in the therapy relationship. And you can experience it towards me. And we can bring it up and out. And with that usually comes, if you do it, not always, it's a spectrum, but if you can get it like right at its most potent end, you pull it up and out, and the person just has this spontaneous recollection of whether it's the mother, the father, it might be a sibling, whatever, like it comes up, and actually the dead body on the floor is that person. And then it just releases the deep, deep grief. Like it's just this outpouring of what the child, we imagine, I guess, would have been too small and incapable relationally to ever feel about this very natural impulse towards the parent who annoys them, who lets them down, who won't let them, you know, do all the things that they want to do, and they don't understand why, because they don't understand how the world works. It's like, you know, it's normal. It's normal for a child to feel, you know, anger towards a parent. And then, anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole. I think you guys know all that well enough now from talking to me. Yeah.
Magnificent. There is something about health and qualitative change that are strongly tied. like a movement into health is qualia.
Qualitative, like there's a change in how you experience qualia and things, right? I think often we confuse like say getting better, like you had an illness and you get better, therefore you're in health. But really, that's kind of a negative move from negative to positive into health. But really, these kind of, well, movement to this, because from this to this is qualitative. Like this is a geometry of qualia, like how you experience reality, right? Like these shapes, like basically, I'm at, a phrase I like to say, they always ask, is math created or discovered? I think basically algebra is created and geometry is discovered. I think geometry is basically the logic by which reality operates. Now, this would have to be justified, but it is why the whole body thinks, because the whole body is more of a geometry where the mind is more of a point, ergo an algebra, right? And the more we can move to a geometry, the more we're in alignment with actuality. And the more aligned you are with actuality, therefore, the more you relate with what is the case. And that actually then creates circulation between actuality and yourself, and energy and negentropy and all these other things. So I think there is something about health and qualitative transformations that are strongly tied. But the qualitative change requires this circulation and this flow and energy, and it's blockages that lead us lots of issues. So, a few things. Like if there's an idea of like the circle, so we have this idea. So there's some interesting things where the outside would necessarily press it down. Okay. So if it's going to be like this, it has to be an internal pushing, right? But then you also need the outer space, because otherwise it would be a point and actually would not be a geometry, right? So you need the outer space. Now, if the outer space is going to open the flat into a circle, if you will, then it has to be another circle that pulls it, right? Like the therapist, right? So that it kind of attracts you up, right? So if you have the therapist, and I think this is basically the geometry of relations that are healthy, is that if someone is like this and you have a flat, there's a risk, since relations are real, the relation is real between these, okay? So it can actually pull it down and make it flat, right? And that can happen, right? And then there's also a mistake where people who are, I'll just say flat, they confuse this with circulation, where they move between flatness or they move on the flat plane, okay? So a lot of times people make one another flat and they move on the flat plane that looks like circulation, but actually you can only get circulation if you go like this. Like circulation has to be spherical, like it has to be a sphere. Otherwise it's just horizontal, right? So what has to happen is as the therapist has to pull this up, right? Like that has to pull up. And then you have a healthy relationship that has a lot of flow, right? There can be one of the problems is you can start to flatten to pull up, and you can't have this happen, right? So you have to have some sort of artful way of pulling up without getting pulled down or going all the way and not being able to recover. You have to maintain the shape, right? But ultimately, the only way you can get this is for the flat to internally do their own circulation and inflation, right? They have to see you as a model and say, I want to be like that, and pull themselves up, right? Or else you get transference that's flattening, or then maybe you get this where the therapist sacrifices themselves for the patient. But that's not, and often if that happens though, then they get reflattened by the relation being off, so you lose your work, right? So it has to geometrically be an internal movement upward, right? And the space is what allows the inflation, right? But the space is also what can have the outside reflatten, right? So you have to have the internal and the external dimensions to allow these kind of movements, but it necessarily brings risk and a certain skillfulness of the interaction to help flatness go up, right? And if you have a circle, because the other thing, you know how we said here you have the points? If you're a circle, you can see down to see the blockage, right? But if you're in the thing, you don't know where the blockage is because you're blocked, right? So when you're at a vertical, you can see where the blockage is occurring. But the problem is they're stuck in the blockage. So they're like, you're crazy. I don't see anything. What are you talking about, right? Because you're over it, right? But what you're doing is you have to get them to see it, to block, and then start inflating themselves, per se, through circulation, right? And the problem is things like transference, which I know is a term for the therapist, is something we do to one another kind of all that we do to one another, you know, all the time. And one of the reasons why, honestly, I would say we're in a friend session, which means nobody has friends anymore, is because we don't have the skills to help one another do that. If we're like this, we go and we get flattened. So then a lot of people like this isolate. And we're basically, in my opinion, the social challenge of our age is the recovery of the social, which we outsourced to the logic of capital in the 1830s to make a giant claim based on belonging again. We didn't want to do the work of the social, so we had economics do our socializing for us. And basically, we're at the age where that will no longer work because it creates blockages and psychosis. But the only way to fix that is to return to being able to do the social. And the only way we recover the social is if we, one, learn how to become a sphere, and then learn how to interact with others without becoming flat again, but actually inspiring them to become spheres, and also not making the mistake that moving this way flat is circulation, right? So there's a geometric recognition that is necessary for a regaining of the social that we now today have to do. And there are certain skills, there are certain awarenesses that facilitate the probability of what this is and its occurrence, but they are not plans. They're preparations. And they're things that require you to do things that no one else understands. Because by definition, this is the weird thing, if you are doing things that everyone understands, then it actually can't be social. It has to be capital. It has to be a flattening logic because it's universal. This is the reason we've lost the social is we don't know how to solve the problem in, I know we have to go and I have to go too, but everyone's wonderful. We have to solve the problem of the universal and the particular, which we've never been able to do. We've never known how to have a universal logic that didn't sacrifice the particular, and we've never known how to have a particular logic that didn't sacrifice the universal. So we basically fluctuated between totalitarianism and fascism for a really long time. All of that, everything we're describing has massive, in my opinion, sociological, economic, and political ramifications. Because if we're in an age that wants to stop swinging between the pendulum of totalitarianism and fascism, or centralization and decentralization. Decentralization is not a new idea. That is a very old idea. And Web 3.0 has a lot of very good ideas. That's an entirely different subject. But merely shifting to decentralization is not actually a sublation of the problems of society and politics that we now face, because there have been many, the American Civil War is a decentralization effort, right? Decentralization tends to work to your neighbors doing something you think is deeply immoral, right? It's easy to talk about decentralization until your neighbor is doing something you think is a moral atrocity, right? And that tends to be when things blow up, right? So I know it's an entirely different subject, but for me, everything we're describing actually has massive economic, political, and social ramifications, because we're actually in the age where we have to figure out how to have a social that is based on personhood, not economic exchange or occupational classification. We need to be able to relate as people, not job titles or how much money we make per year or a simple classification. But if that's what we're going to do, which is notably difficult under pluralism, you're talking about figuring out how to go from this to this and how to stay as this as you encounter this and inspire this to become this and continue that spread of that activity at scale. That is what you're talking about. And those are skills that are not obvious what they are, because they couldn't be, because if they were, they would be a system. They would be implemented by the system of economics. It is necessarily particular per person, per situation, and figuring out what each individual needs to do to work on their own individual means of apprehension, which for one person could be creating a language, another person could be finding patterns on a piano, another person could be reading Hegel, like these, or taking walks in the woods. These different individual means of cultivating apprehension have to be made space for, which means it has to be on an individual relational basis, which means you have to learn those skills. There's no other road. The other road must, by definition, be a system that shuts down these diverse ways of cultivating apprehension. It must be. So we have to create incubators instead of these flattening institutions, and that is our challenge.
I love the circles and I love the way that you drew out the different dynamics there that are available, and how this like going around like this is the faux sense of that's so helpful, because that's exactly what it's like. And I guess in my mind, just to finish things up, there's something here about like the energy which allows us to be inflated. It's the wrong word because it sounds grandiose, but maybe that's a good thing, that allows us to be inflated as a sphere, right? I think that depends. I think that depends on the health of our of our access to our authentic resonance. Like I actually think that it's maybe like kind of that same pipeline or whatever it is.
Yeah.
To authentic resonance, that is the thing that's kind of like the gas that keeps us inflated or something, and able to remain inflated and trust that we will remain inflated, even if we're interacting with someone who's like this or whatever it is, that we don't have to conform to them, or that some sort of parasitic dynamics going to take place, or so this has just been wonderful. It's brought lots of pieces together, and I actually yeah, I'm sad we have to wrap up because there's lots more I could say, but I am also feeling tired, so it's probably a good thing that we're wrapping up. But that's brilliant. I love that. Seth, please, any final words? Always thought that too.
Yeah,
On the tip of my tongue this whole time.
Yeah, this was beautiful. Thank you both.
Yeah.
This has been delightful. Yes, delightful. Thank you.
Just so you guys know, that is actually the symbol of a health fund over in Australia. They do, and they do
Wow,
that in the
they
ads.
owe us. The royalties should come rolling in for the free marketing. Oh my gosh.
They got on a time machine, listened to our conversation, then developed their marketing.
Money is effortless when you're in a state of authentic resonance.
See? Like it just happens. You know, stocks only go up. Self-care. This has
Lovely
been
to see you
delightful.
all.
Thank you so much.